All right, we reversed
Thanks,
orders, but Chief Dennis Kohlmeyer are up.
Good evening, everybody. All right, so starting with the salaries, obviously a new chief, there's a different pay rate there, so that their first line there. Compensation package is a little bit different than the 2021. The officer salaries is going to maintain current staffing. There is no additional staffing being added to the organization in that line. So that maintains our current 33 patrol officers, including from lieutenant down to patrolman, 2 SROs, which has some reimbursement from the school district, and 1 task force officer. The salary compensation for retirements is moved up slightly. So we've seen that when we have a number of officers that can retire, they do retire. So this year we've had 3 of the 5 eligible to retire this year leave already, and we have 1 more that has notified us that he will be leaving this calendar or fiscal year as well. So that'll be 4 of the 5. So next year we will have 4 eligible members to retire as well. We're not anticipating all of them going, but we are preparing for a portion of them to retire. So the officer's holiday pay is increased based on some historical numbers. The way that we paid that out, we altered the lines a little bit to more accurately reflect where that money is coming from at the end of the year. So that's moved up to 150. Overtime is being kept at what we've done as a pretty constant rate historically, based on the fluctuation in either staffing or critical incidents. So it's a little bit hard to narrowly define what that line will be over a fiscal year, but based on historical numbers, we're comfortable with the 200,000. The DWI overtime and overtime grant reimbursed, so the lines now reflect being 0. Again, that's to more accurately reflect where the money has come from historically. So instead of putting it in as projected expense and having it come out of another line item, it's been adjusted to accurately reflect our practices. Clerical salaries have increased slightly, and that's due to some restructuring of our office environment and the impact of some of the additional responsibilities that have put on the police department with the legislative changes in law enforcement. So there's a larger administrative workload on timelines of getting documentation for criminal cases through the system. So to accommodate that and give us some functionality, we've restructured the 3 full-time clerical staff and have them at clerk titles equivalent with the duties that they're performing. Clerical overtime is a minimal expense, but we have that occasionally, so there's a slight increase in that. Part-time wages, again, that's remaining fairly constant other than a slight increase for cost of living. School crossing guards, we're anticipating that line item will return to what it was in historical figures. It's been slightly increased in 2021 due to the way the elementary schools shifted their staffing. It went to twice-a-day models, so essentially we're crossing kids 4 times a day instead of 2. So historically, 6,200 covers the twice-a-day, Monday through Friday elementary school crossings that we do at the public schools. Tobacco compliance and underage, again, kind of restructuring some of the line items and where money is being expended from. That hasn't been as big of an impact, so it's not projected to be a part of 2022. Overtime for school resource officers, we've seen an increase in that based on the responsibilities the school district is assigning. That's a reimbursed line from the school district, so that is compensated in the revenue portion, but we're accounting for the expense side through this line item. Capital Purchases Office, again, that's maintaining facilities, so that includes things like the desk furniture, the locker room facilities and things like that to maintain and upgrade the system as we continue moving forward. Capital Purchase Miscellaneous is an increase, and again, that is to kind of accurately reflect how we're expending our money. Some of the line items that were used before, I felt this would be a more appropriate title. So it's allocation of money from non-capital lines to the capital purchase. And in this case, it includes a $10,000 item to replace the license plate reader systems that are now outdated or antiquated from the ones that we have and no longer function. So that's where 10,000 of that 550 comes from. The other 5,500 is capital equipment like tasers that are replaced on a regular basis that were previously coming out of a non-capital line item. Capital purchase firearms is again maintaining the weapon systems that we use, pistol, rifles, shotguns, and equipment that is used to support them, lights, optics, things like that that go along with it. Capital purchase tax services, it looks like a significant decrease, but there was a $100,000 offsetting grant that was anticipated in 2021 for body cameras. We went with a different model and didn't do a large capital purchase on the body cameras, and we'll talk about that again in a minute when we get to some of the services line where they'll see an increase. But we went with a model up front to purchase the equipment and then a reoccurring expense for the cloud-based storage for that software. So for vehicle accessories, again, that's a little bit of restructuring of the line items to more accurately reflect where the expenses were coming from. There's a line item down below that is decreased to offset that, what appears to be a $12,500 increase there. Capital purchase vehicles, that includes 3 vehicle purchases, so 2 marked vehicles and 1 unmarked. Our fleet consists of 12 marked patrol vehicles and 6 unmarked, plus a couple other special services vehicles. Based on the mileage usage, typically we get about 35,000 miles out of a patrol car that the officers are driving, 2 officers assigned, total of 18 officers, so there's 9 vehicles associated with that. The traffic car accounts for another vehicle, and then the 2 sergeants' vehicles that are marked as well are about 30,000 annually. So in order to keep that fleet of 12 rotating, we get between 4 and 5 years per vehicle. So that's mostly 2 cars per year for the marked fleet to maintain that fleet moving forward. And then with the unmarked fleet, there are 6 vehicles associated with that, and the mileage usage on that is less. So we get between 6 and 7 years out of the vehicle in that rotation. So in order to keep the fleet operating, the purchases for this year reflect 3 vehicles, 2 marked patrol and 1 unmarked. Capital purchase DWI, that's standard historical number that typically accounts for 1 radar unit or breathalyzer equipment or things along that lines. This year it's for a radar unit. Professional development is a line item for the chief's office for training, and that's increased there based on the cost of the conferences and training that's associated with them. Court cost for retired officers, we are expecting to have an increase in that based on one of our investigators retiring and her involvement in a lot of significant cases that are going to be coming to court over the next fiscal year. So we expect to have some increase to that as well. Regular phones, that's for the administrative and on-duty supervisors. That's historical cost, contractual through state bid for the cell phones. Office expenses decreased slightly this year, not anticipating as much expense that we did in 2021. Equipment lease expense, that comes from our copiers that we use part of our service, so that's most of the line item for that. Service contracts is one I was referring to, where there's a significant increase based on the body-worn camera cost. So when we looked at the pricing models that were available to us, cloud-based storage was the most functional model that we could put into practice. So there's a significant cost built into there for the body-worn cameras, and then there's costs associated with the other contract services that we use as part of our investigative function. So there's a lot of investigative either softwares or service contracts that are built into that line item. Shipping expense, again, minimal based on history. Telephone expense is the in-building telephone system, so that's different than the cellular phones. That's the voicemail and telephone systems used on a daily basis. That is paper and other ancillary equipment for functioning the computer systems. Community service supplies historically isn't a big expense, given the fact that we don't have an active community services unit. We do still do community service functions though. So that is supplies for our road patrol officers and SROs to use when they're doing community-related events. Firearms Supplies is a non-capital purchasing. So that's the ammunition, that's the targets, that's the disposable items that get consumed during the fiscal year, not the things that are part of the long-term assets. Investigative expenses are things that come up where we have to pay for either officers or investigators to travel to other locations to conduct investigations, pay for records or other things associated with subpoenas that come along through the daily course of business with investigations. So it's a very historical rate, fluctuates depending on the caseload. Technical service expenses, not expecting as significant of a expenditure in 2022, so reduce that line slightly. Miscellaneous equipment expenses, again, that's part of the shift of money from this line to the capital lines, just to accurately reflect the equipment that is going to be maintained as assets beyond the fiscal year. Technical contracts is the cost for getting photos developed that aren't done in-house, they're done through a contract service, so that covers the cost there. Vehicle repairs, again, some of the vehicle setup costs for new vehicles were being associated with that line item, so I altered that so that the capital vehicle accessories line increased, and the money was reallocated from the vehicle repairs, again, to reflect practices. Vehicle tires, that's due to just cost of wear and tear, and increased based on current market. Vehicle gasoline, not anticipating additional consumption. That's to reflect a potential increase in cost of fuel as we move through 2022. I reduced clothing expenses and uniforms by $5,000. That is very dependent on who we hire and when we hire. So with 4 potential retirements next year. We didn't reduce it significantly, but based on some historical data, I felt comfortable reducing that down to 30,000. EAP, that's projected based on historical usage. Physical expense, again, is also related to partly the hiring process, and partly due to the expense of the health and welfare of our employees, firearms instructors, getting blood testing, things like that. Training expense covers the travel expenses for officers to attend training or course administrative enrollment fees, or costs that we incur to host or conduct our own training in-house. Miscellaneous expenses is based on historical data, no significant increase there. Same thing with department supplies. And uniform cleaning is contractual rate from the town and the collective bargaining agreement for uniform cleaning. So as mentioned before, under revenue, the school resource officer agreement with Webster Central School District is going to continue through 2022. So that is the cost that is reimbursed to the town for 2 uniform patrol officers to be assigned to the school district for the school year. Those officers are still under the direction and control of the police department, and during the holidays, breaks, and summer months, they are reassigned by the police department to provide a traffic function. The traffic officers assigned to both the day and the afternoon shift. Police reports, that's based on historical data. Those are the chargebacks we get for copies of reports through a service for accident reports to like insurance companies. Fingerprinting is a chargeable service that the town provides for residents, and there is some revenue associated with that. DWI, county and other, is grant money provided to the town for targeted activity like DWI, roving patrols, traffic checkpoints, things like that. We have a rotating process of replacing ballistic vests for officers. There's a 5-year rotation on each vest, so that is a continual grant process that we go through to get some reimbursement for the expense that we bear with that. Alarm fines is, again, based on historical data for the repeat response to businesses and residents that have burglar alarms that are deemed to be negligent, not actual valid alarms. And then that was 2021, $100,000 expected grant for buying more cameras that is not going to be part of 2022.
Dennis?
Okay. Questions?
No, but I have a comment.
Yes, sir.
Earlier in the year, there was an article in our local paper that was discussing your specific salary being such an increase from 137 to 150. What I think is important that the residents also know that while there is an increase in salary, there's a significant decrease in employment because of the things that we do not have to pay in your hiring.
Yes, sir.
Such as?
Yeah, so essentially, I did re-enter the retirement system, being a retired former member of the police department. So there isn't the contributions associated with my salary. If I wasn't a member of the retirement system, I believe for 2021 it was right around 25% of the salary as part of the contribution cost to New York State from the town. So essentially what it does is offsets the long-term cost versus the current fiscal cost.
So during our negotiations and contractual employment for you, this is what was discussed, and fact of the matter is, the cost of employing you today is much less than what we were paying our previous chief. I just wanted to make that comment so people knew.
See, I'm a garden all the way around.
Okay.
Barry, you stole some of my thunder, but I'll hold off because I had a point too, so thank you. Bill? Comments, questions? No. Okay. No? Yeah?
I will say that the cost of law enforcement in this town is pretty high, as we've seen the numbers. But we also hear from our residents that it's the service that they support. They feel very strongly about.
Yeah, in fact, I don't think I have to elaborate too much on the last year and a half in society. People are looking at law enforcement and the calls we get in. You're not going to defund your police, or people that call in and say, we want you to defund that word, that ugly word, defund. Actually, we've invested in our police department with the body cams. So we went the other route, but as Patty, as you said, I think that was, we're supposed to be representative of our community, the 5 board members. I think we are representing our community. Our community as a whole likes our police department. Just a couple of notes I had here from this, because, the 800-pound gorilla in the middle of the room is that when you take a look at the 2021 budget for the police, all in, net of the revenue, it's $3.84 million, and this year, right now, and I can't stress this enough, this isn't the final budget, but it's at $4.268 million. It's about 11.2% increase. Barry hit on a point that it's something early on, and I talked to Paul about, is that the way fund accounting works with the state comptroller and whatever, I don't like that we can't match up sometimes on these reports the benefits, which are health insurance and pension funding and all that for each department. Where you'll see it next week's, you'll see some B fund or A fund departments like DPW or whatever that does match up with those benefits. Is that correct? Or sewer?
That's correct.
Right?
Because they're in their own fund.
So, I wrote an article a couple weeks ago that said, hey, here's a revelation for everybody if you didn't know it. 70% of the town of Webster's budget is employees and retirees based. Their gross payroll, the employee paid payroll taxes like FICA, the employer paid benefits such as health insurance, funding of health savings accounts, and pension funding. Does that about hit them all, Paul?
Yeah. Workers' comp,
Thank you. So it's hard to compare that against private industry, because certain private industries have higher percentage of their cost in personnel than other industries. But I will say this, when you have that in a budget like the town of Webster's, it is a challenge as we approach annual budgets when we have this looming state 2% tax cap, when we're in the middle of 3 union contracts that all are 2% and above for cost of living adjustments annually. The police, I think, and Paul, you correct me if I'm wrong, as a department, about 85% of their budget, all in, is really personnel related.
correct.
Okay. Now, you have the payrolls, and Barry already touched on, on chiefs, that you got to compare apples to apples. So on the surface, it looks like, well, why is Chief Dennis so much higher than the previous chiefs? You just explained it. When you do it all in, actually he financially is significantly less expensive. Okay? Now, because of union contracts and all that, the amount of health insurance that the town pays on behalf of the active officers and the retiree officers is pretty high, okay? There's been an effort to move them to see the benefits of a high deductible premium that is also subsidized by a health savings account. I don't want to get into too much details here tonight. I think we had some success in that at open enrollment in January of '21. Is that correct, Paul?
We did.
Okay.
There was some movement.
And obviously, that movement and the continued movement of that would help the town financially, but it doesn't reflect in this budget because those expenses are not shown based on the way the state comptroller sets up the funds. So that's a challenge. It just is. I mean, the cost of the benefits, the cost of the union contracts went 85%. Second thing I noted here was that the revenue. Chief and I have, I think we've somewhat hit it off because we're kind of accountants at heart. I don't want to insult you, all right? But you are finishing up this year with your MBA at Syracuse?
Got a couple more semesters here.
Yeah. So, I don't know if the word would be called, that it's been enjoyable talking to Chief about financial things because he is higher on the scale of understanding this stuff than the typical chief of police. And that's nothing against other chief of police. Most of them don't almost have their MBA.
Speak language.
He speaks the language, yeah, which can help us and hurt us at times, right, Chief? There is a potential, and we're trying to put ourselves in a position to help out with increasing this revenue. You've shown some programs that some of the federal and state agencies are using. I know the one ERAD or EROD or whatever, we just signed up, and I think you already got some money in.
We're working on it, yeah, for
Yeah.
potential there.
And then obviously, with our relationship, I think, with the DEA, based on being in that, where it's not the main reason we have an officer in that, but the ancillary benefit is that we would get a much higher percentage of seized money if they're involved in something that happens down in Canandaigua.
Yeah, so basically what it does is, one, it helps us address the problem we have in our community when it comes to the drug issues and the regional problem that we have. It helps us with the cost of overtime associated with that position based on the way they structured the program. And then obviously the seizure of assets that happen during investigations, we get a portion of that, which helps us with our overall public safety expenditures for the town.
Right. So it'll be interesting as time goes on. I know you and Paul and I have talked about it, to track forecasted, if you want to say, budgeted revenues to what actually comes in. Because I think in the years to come, it's reasonable to assume that they might become a greater actual number than forecast from the past because of certain positions you're putting yourself in. Luck is the residue of design, right? And last, when Barry and I and Paul and several other people were involved in the negotiation of the most recent police contract this past year, we saw that this overtime and vacation line had some challenges to managing it throughout the year because there is a bank that they put it into, and then at the end of the year at Christmas they take out the bank. And it gives the illusion during the year that we're running well, actual to budget on those items. But the actual to budget on those items historically had exceeded, the actual had exceeded. You know, we want to we want to be conservative on expense budgets. If your expense goes over the budget, one, that's illegal because we have agreed on an appropriation line So when we start to see that happen, that's when Paul's got to get creative and do budget transfers, right? But I think we all would agree that we would like to stop that trend. So we're this year, I think between the two, we have $350,000 currently budgeted for the aggregate of vacation and overtime, is that correct? I would like to think we are going to stop what has happened in years past. We're going to track it better. We're going to, and obviously there are some things, there's some events that just cause overtime and you can't control it. But there are other things that you can through, I think you've shown good scheduling, good syncing up of certain officers and whatever based on. There's ways to control that, monitor it.
Yeah, there's essentially three components to the overtime. One is the impacts of staffing requirements. So if you're not staffed appropriately and you have to pay overtime to cover shifts, that's one component. Two is proactive details that we go into knowing that we're setting them outside of the normal shift structures and it's going to cost us overtime to staff. That would be public events or things like that. And the third one would be the critical incidents, and that's our unknown. So through proper staffing, we aim to reduce the first problem. Through good supervision, we look to limit the second problem, and then third problems are out of our control. But when it comes to actually managing those incidents, it has to be part of a conversation as to how we're allocating resources. So that's hopefully to bring that in line, and then still avoid having that basically mislabeling of what the overtime was when it was coming from the holiday, and essentially ended up with an unknown balloon payment at the end of the year that blew the line at the last minute. So.
Yeah, historically, what should have been holiday pay ended up in overtime because the officers typically put holidays in their comp bank, and the comp bank is paid out toward the end of the year, and it was all charged to overtime. So now, at the end of the year, we're making sure that we get that holiday pay line correct, 12 holidays times 33 officers times their compensation, and just right-sizing it so it's not buried in overtime. So that's why you're seeing the big increase on the holiday line. It's not actually an increase, it was buried in overtime in prior years. If you can understand that. Probably not very clear.
No,
I
because
think it makes
the
sense.
overtime might stay the same.
Yeah, the overtime line is stayed the same.
Well, so if you went back one more year to 2020, it was a combined like 350, I believe, in 2020.
Yeah, if the combined, it was underestimated consistently. You got to make up for it with budget transfers each year.
How many vehicles is this line? 352?
Three. Two at 35,000 for marked patrol and one at 30,000 for unmarked.
Good. Thanks, Chief. And it's a fluid process, and we'll go from here.
Thank you, Chief.
All right.